minus c. Okay. The next thing we did was to get rid of the a by dividing everything by a. X squared plus b over a x equals minus c over a. And we now have it in a form in which we can complete the square. We have x squared plus a number times x, and we got a blank space in there to fill in the term that'll make this a perfect square. So to do that, we go down over here. That's a plus. We want to get that perfect square. Well, this term right here is going to be half of b over a. And half of b over a is b over 2a. That is, multiplying b over a by 1/2, you get b over 2a. Which means the term over here is going to be, what's it going to be? It's going to be this squared. It's going to be b squared over 4a squared. Because remember, we got this last term by squaring this term right here. If we had a 2 here, we put a 4 there. If we had a 5 here, we put a 25, because we're going to square b over 2a. Okay? If we add b squared over 4a squared to one side, we really need to add it to the other side. So let's go ahead and just put it over here. b squared over 4a squared. Well, this side we have the perfect square. You may remember our next step was to combine those two terms. And if there was a fraction involved, what we did was to use the common denominator. The common denominator here is 4a squared. That already has the common denominator, and a times 4a will give me 4a squared. I'm going to do two things now. I'm going to multiply top and bottom by 4a, and I'm going to move this around because I want to have the plus in front. I don't like minuses in front. So this stays the same, b squared over 4a squared, and then minus, and we're going to multiply top and bottom to get the 4a squared, multiplying top and bottom by 4a, which is 4ac. Let me pause for a moment here and say, again, I just want to show this to you. If I were your teacher, I would never ask you to reproduce this. And some teachers will never show you this. They just say, here's the formula. I want you to know where the formula came from. Okay, back to work. What did we do next? When we got the perfect square, we took the square root. X plus b over 2a equals. Well, b squared minus 4ac, I can't figure out right away what the square root is, so I'll just write plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, and that whole thing is inside the square root. I can take the square root of 4a squared. The square root of 4 is 2. The square root of a squared is a. We had problems like we had x plus something or x minus something. We wanted to get rid of that number. We want to isolate the x. We want to solve for x. So what do? X equals, and we subtract this b over 2a from both sides. The nice thing is, you'll notice, we have a common denominator. Isn't that nice? Minus b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Nice squeaky pen here. Okay. Now perhaps you can't see that too well. Perhaps you don't like blue. So let's go to the next visual, which is actually the first visual, and it says to you, this is the quadratic formula. And once again, let me read the quadratic formula to you. If you haven't already done so, write it down. X equals minus b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. The entire thing is over 2a. This is how we solve any, I repeat, any quadratic equation of the form ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. Okay. Now, one thing we should notice is that, now let's go back over here to the easel. This b squared minus 4ac is quite important. Because if b squared minus 4ac is positive, we can take the square root of it. If it's 0, the square root of 0 is 0, and plus or minus 0 will give us only one answer. In other words, if this was 6, 6 plus 0 and 6 minus 0, they're both 6. On the other hand, if b squared minus 4ac is negative, we have a problem, because in terms of the course to date on this series, we haven't talked yet about the square root of a negative. So in that case, we'd say we don't have any roots or any real roots. And again, the word root is another word in mathematics for solution or answer. Okay? So let's go to the next visual, which shows us what's called the discriminant. You'll notice that the b squared minus 4ac inside the square root is in blue. It's also in blue listed in the chart. And it says, let's look at b squared minus 4ac. If that number is greater than 0, what should we do? We'll know we have two real answers. Why? Because when we take the square root of a positive number, we take the square root of b squared minus 4ac, we'll have plus or minus that square root added to our negative b. We'll have two answers. On the other hand, if b squared minus 4ac is equal to 0, then we have only one real answer. As I said earlier, the reason for that is we have plus or minus the square root of 0, which is plus or minus 0, which is the same thing. Only one real answer. On the last line, if b squared minus 4ac is less than 0, we have no real answers. In lesson 17, we'll discover what to do about square roots and negatives. But right now, if we get a b squared minus 4ac that is negative, we say stop, that's it, we have no real answer. So we have something, this something is called the discriminant, the b squared minus 4ac, which is a very powerful tool because it enables us to look immediately and say, wait, we got two answers, we have one answer, or we have no real answers. And in fact, as I've indicated before, I really like my students to work in a very step-by-step method, because that's how I work, and I think it really helps get to the bottom of a problem. So the next visual has the steps to solving a quadratic. A quadratic what? A quadratic equation. Step 1 is to get it in the form ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. You may recall in earlier lessons we had some quadratics that were not in that form, and we had to get everything over. That's no problem. You know how to do that. But step 1 is to get it in that form. If it already is in that form, well, that's good. We go ahead and start right there. Step 2, step 2 is to write down A, B, and C. You may see, gee, that's kind of silly. Why? I mean, I could see A, B, and C right there. Why should I have to write it down? I have found in years of teaching that by writing that down, students tend to make fewer errors. Because remember, we have to find negative B. And sometimes people put the wrong signs in for negative B. By writing down what B is and A and C, it's a better guarantee of putting the right numbers into the formula. So that's step 2. Write down what A, B, and C are. Step 3 is b squared minus 4ac. That's the discriminant. If it's positive, you know you have two real roots. If it's 0, only one real root. If it's negative, you have no real roots. But there's something else very, very nice about the discriminant. If that's positive, and let's say the answer was the b squared minus 4ac was 49, not only would I know that I'd have two real roots, I'd also know that I'm able to take the square root of that. Because remember, we take the square root of b squared minus 4ac, and that would be 7. Because the square root of 49 is 7. On the other hand, if b squared minus 4ac was 48, I would know that I'm not going to be able to take the square root directly, because 48 is not a square number. Step 4 is writing down the formula. And I would suggest the first 10 or 15 times you solve a quadratic formula, go back, the first few times you solve a quadratic equation, write down the quadratic formula. Write it down until you've memorized it, and memorized it correctly. Because if you don't know it and you take a test, you could make a mistake and you have real problems there. So there's the quadratic formula. We're going to actually solve. Now, of course, we already have the b squared minus 4ac. Another advantage of doing it step by step, you are not looking at a whole mass of multiplication and squaring and square roots and subtraction and division. Because you're writing a negative b, plus or minus, you know what the square root is because you know what b squared minus 4ac is from part 3, step 3, and over 2a. You get the answer or answers. Remember, you could have two answers or one answer or no answers. If you have two answers or one answer, then step 5 is to check your answer or check your answers. Let's do a few problems. I think it'd be a good idea to work through a couple of these. And again, I would suggest that what you do is, when you have the time, write these problems down on a separate piece of paper and then work them at a later time and see if you can. If you can't work them, come back to the tape, rewind the tape to that point, and watch me work it again. But I think if you'll follow the 5-step process, you'll probably find that this is not very, very tough to do. So the next visual shows us the problem x squared plus 9x, x squared plus 9 equals 6x. This is the problem. The question is solve for x. It's a quadratic. The first step in the quadratic process is to get it into ax squared plus bx plus c form. So we simply subtract 6x from both sides, and we now have line 2, which is highlighted, x squared minus